I'm Theo Harris, husband to Gwen, dad to an incredible little boy named Louis, and a marketing manager for a company that keeps me busy, but not so much that I miss out on the important things. Gwen and I have been married for 10 years, and together, we've built what feels like a solid life. Louis, who's in second grade, is the light of our lives. He's sharp, curious, and has a laugh that can brighten even the hardest days. Gwen, for her part, balances it all effortlessly. Or at least that's how it seems. While I handle my job, she works part-time at a boutique downtown, selling high-end clothing and accessories. It's a job she loves, not just for the extra income, but because it gives her a chance to connect with people and stay in touch with the world outside of being a mom. She's good at it too, friendly, approachable, and with an eye for style that seems to draw customers in. We've always been a close-knit family, but we also have a wider circle that keeps life interesting. At the center of that circle are our best friends, Jesse and Albert. Gwen and Jesse have been close for years, long before either of them had kids. Their friendship naturally pulled our families together, and over time, the bonds between all of us grew. Weekends were our time to catch up and unwind. Sometimes it was a simple dinner at their place. Other times, we hosted barbecues in the backyard, with the kids running around while the adults sat on the deck talking about everything and nothing. Louis and their daughter, Emma, got along great, and watching them play always reminded me of how lucky we were to have found friends like Jesse and Albert. Albert was, well, Albert. He had this larger-than-life presence that made people gravitate toward him. He was a successful entrepreneur, the kind of guy who seemed to live on a different plane than most of us. Fancy cars, lavish vacations, a big house that seemed like it belonged in a magazine. It all came with the territory. But what I appreciated most about him was how down-to-earth he could be. He didn't act like he was better than anyone, at least not in the ways that mattered. Life was good, steady. The days had their rhythm, the weeks their routine. Louis was thriving in school, Gwen enjoyed her job, and I felt like we were exactly where we were meant to be. One evening, Jesse invited me over under the pretense of discussing an upcoming school fundraiser for the kids. Gwen was working late at the boutique, so I figured I'd swing by for a quick chat. When I arrived, Jessie seemed nervous, fidgeting with her coffee mug and avoiding eye contact. I tried to keep my tone calm and reassuring as I asked her what was going on and if everything was okay. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine as if she was trying to decide whether to say anything at all. After what felt like an eternity, she let out a heavy sigh and admitted that there was something she needed to tell me. The seriousness in her tone made it clear this wasn't about a fundraiser. She said she'd been noticing some things and, after a brief pause, admitted that she thought Gwen and Albert had been spending time together, alone. I blinked, struggling to process her words. For a moment, I couldn't quite grasp what she was implying, so I asked her what she meant. Jessie's eyes shone with unshed tears. She told me about the day she came home early and saw Gwen's car parked on the street. At first, she thought Gwen was just visiting, but when she went inside, she heard moans and strange noises. My head spun. This couldn't be right. Gwen and Albert? It didn't make sense. I tried to make sense of it, grasping at any explanation that might ease the tension. I told her they could have been planning something for us. After all, that's how they were, always scheming to surprise us. Jessie shook her head, her voice trembling. She admitted that she wanted to believe it too, but since then she'd started to notice something. She said they'd disappear at the same time during gatherings and seemed closer than they should be. I sat there, stunned, the words not fully sinking in. Gwen and I had been through so much together. She couldn't. Jessie's hand gently rested on mine, and I could feel the weight of her words. She apologized, her voice soft, saying she didn't know how else to tell me. She just felt I deserved to know the truth. The rest of the evening was a blur. I thanked Jessie, though the words felt hollow, and left her house in a daze. The drive home was quiet, the usual radio chatter muted as my mind raced. When I walked through the door, Gwen was already there, looking as radiant as ever. She greeted me with a smile, but for the first time in our 10 years together, I felt a pang of doubt. I told myself it wasn't true, that there had to be some explanation. But as I watched her move around the kitchen, humming softly to herself, I couldn't shake the weight pressing down on my chest. For the next few days, I walked around in a fog. Jesse's words had settled into my mind like an unwelcome guest, refusing to leave no matter how much I tried to push them away. I wanted to dismiss them, to tell myself that Jessie was mistaken or overthinking things. But the way she'd looked at me, the tremble in her voice, it was hard to ignore. Gwen, as always, seemed perfectly herself. She still laughed at Lewis's jokes, made dinner while humming some old pop song, and asked me about my day when I got home. Everything felt so ordinary, so normal, that I started questioning if I was the one imagining things. Then came the late nights. Gwen had always worked occasional evening shifts at the boutique, especially around busy seasons like holidays or sales. But lately, those shifts seemed more frequent. I watched as she grabbed her coat from the hook by the door that Tuesday, and I couldn't help but ask myself if it was going to be another late night. She nodded, adjusting her scarf, and I heard her voice, quiet but resigned, as she explained it was inventory. Always a mess this time of year. Her explanation was reasonable enough. Still, I found myself watching her leave, the way she moved quickly, almost as if she was in a rush. Was it always like that? Or was I just looking for something that wasn't there? One night, after she'd left for another evening at the boutique, I found myself restless. Lewis had gone to bed, the house was quiet, and the hum of the dishwasher in the background wasn't enough to distract me. I wandered into our bedroom, intending to grab a book, but my eyes landed on her side of the closet. I don't know what made me do it, but I opened the door and started looking around. At first, everything seemed normal. Clothes, shoes, the occasional shopping bag from the mall. But tucked away in the back corner was something that caught my attention. A small shopping bag from a high-end lingerie store. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out, feeling a mix of guilt and apprehension. Inside was a delicate set of lace lingerie, something I'd never seen Gwen wear before. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Gwen wasn't the type to hide things from me. She loved showing me her new purchases, asking my opinion, or teasing me about what was to come. But this felt out of character. I put the bag back exactly as I'd found it, my hands trembling. Maybe it was meant to be a surprise, I told myself. Maybe she was planning something for us. But as much as I wanted to believe that, the knot in my stomach told a different story. The next day, I tried to push it to the back of my mind. Over breakfast, I asked her casually how work had been. She let out a tired smile as she stirred cream into her coffee, telling me that work had been busy. The new manager, she explained, was really particular. She had them redo inventory twice just to make sure everything was perfect. I said it sounded exhausting, though I couldn't help but watch her carefully as she spoke. Gwen admitted with a shrug that it was exhausting, but then she seemed to brighten up. She said, in a lighter tone, that it was probably a good thing. It kept her on her toes. Her answer seemed natural, but there was something about the way she quickly shifted topics that made me pause. I didn't press further. Lewis came bounding into the kitchen with his backpack, ready for school, and the moment passed. The next evening, Gwen had another late shift. After dinner, I cleaned up the kitchen, tucked Lewis into bed, and settled on the couch with a book. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that bag in the closet. As the hours ticked by, I started piecing together moments I'd overlooked. Gwen's shifts, the occasional sidelong glance during our group hangouts with Jesse and Albert. The way Albert's voice seemed just a little too familiar when he spoke to her. At the time, I'd written it off as friendly banter, but now I wasn't so sure. When Gwen finally came home that night, her hair was a little messy, and there was a faint flush on her cheeks. She kicked off her shoes and apologized for being late, saying it took forever to get everything organized. I tried to keep my tone steady and said it was fine, then asked her how it had gone. She brushed past me to hang up her coat and said it was the same as always. I watched her carefully, searching for some clue, some hint that would confirm or deny the storm building in my head. But Gwen smiled, kissed my cheek, and went upstairs to change, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, something inside me knew the time had come. I had spent days wrestling with my thoughts, feeling the tension between what I knew and what I still tried to convince myself was just a misunderstanding. But now the truth was undeniable. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that Gwen and I were the same couple we had always been. So, I asked her to sit down with me. I try to keep my voice steady, to make it clear that this conversation wasn't about anger or accusations. It was about something much deeper, something I had to hear from her. When she sat across from me on the couch, looking as if nothing was wrong, I took a deep breath and began. I didn't come at her with accusations. I didn't want to be rash, not yet. Instead, I spoke slowly, trying to control the storm inside me. I told her I knew. I told her I knew about the affair. She stiffened at my words, her eyes flashing with something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, she said nothing, as if she was processing what I had just said. Then, as if trying to dismiss everything I had just shared, she shook her head and laughed lightly. She tried to downplay the situation, saying it was Jesse, as usual. She told me Jesse was always trying to stir up drama and that I couldn't seriously believe her over what Gwen had said. She must have made something up to cause trouble between us. But I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I knew the details Jesse had given me. The way Gwen and Albert had been disappearing together. The way they'd acted around each other when no one was looking. I reminded her of everything Jesse had told me. The way she caught them in moments of intimacy. The strange closeness between them that was hard to ignore. Her laughter faded, and her eyes darted away from mine, unable to meet my gaze. Her lips trembled slightly, and I saw the coldness settling into her expression. For a moment, she said nothing, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum announcing that the moment of truth had come. Finally, she spoke, quietly, almost as if the words didn't belong to her. She told me, her voice flat and emotionless, that she had been seeing Albert. I was hit with a wave of disbelief, but I kept my composure. The anger I had been holding in for so long was threatening to explode, but I needed answers. I couldn't let her off the hook so easily. I asked her why. Why would she do this? Why would she betray me, betray Louis, for something like this? I had given her everything. We had a life together, a family. What could she possibly have wanted that I couldn't give her? She looked at me for a moment, almost as if she was considering whether to lie, to make up another excuse. But then she sighed, as if tired of pretending. Suddenly, her voice grew sharp, filled with frustration, as she asked if I knew what it was like to live on a budget all the time. Her eyes narrowed, and in that moment, the mask she'd been wearing shattered completely. She told me that Albert gave her something I never could, freedom. The words hit me like a slap. Freedom. That was what she had been searching for all this time. The freedom to not worry about bills, about living paycheck to paycheck, about the constant stress that had been our reality for years. She went on, her frustration growing with each word, saying that every little thing was a struggle with me. She was always watching what she spent, always making sure she didn't go over budget, and no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. She said Albert didn't care about any of that. He gave her a taste of something different, something better. I stood there in shock, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't just talking about an affair. She wasn't just talking about Albert. She was talking about us, about our life together. All those years of hard work, all the sacrifices we had made for our family, and this is what it had come to. She had betrayed me, not for another man, but for material gain. I felt sick. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't look away. I wanted to shout, to scream at her, to demand she take it all back, but I couldn't. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that she had done this for a taste of luxury, for the feeling of being free from financial pressure, even if it meant losing everything else. Louis, our son, our life, our trust, all of it didn't matter in the face of that. I asked her if she was really telling me she gave up everything for money. Gwen didn't even flinch. She shrugged, her expression as cold as her words. She replied, her voice laced with bitterness, saying she hadn't thrown anything away. She was just trying to survive. She told me I didn't understand, that I never understood how hard it was to live the way we were. Albert, she said, gave her something I couldn't, and if I couldn't understand that, then maybe I wasn't the one who was broken. Her words hit me harder than anything she'd said before. I couldn't look at her anymore. I turned away, feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted, like everything I had built with Gwen had just been reduced to rubble. She didn't apologize. There was no remorse, no regret in her eyes. It was as if I had been just another obstacle in her pursuit of something better. I had become the person standing in the way of her freedom, of her escape from the life she no longer wanted. I didn't know what to say after that. The pain was overwhelming, and the realization that Gwen's betrayal was fueled by greed, by her desire for a different life, shook me to my core. I was no longer just dealing with an affair. I was dealing with the destruction of everything I thought we had built together. As I walked away, my mind was a blur. The trust we had shared, the love I thought was unshakable, was gone. And I knew, deep down, that there was no coming back from this. The days after my confrontation with Gwen were a blur. The weight of the conversation hung over me like a dark cloud that wouldn't lift. I had no idea how to navigate the mess she had created, and the hardest part was realizing that my son, Louis, would be affected by everything going on. I knew that I couldn't shelter him forever, that the reality of our situation was going to hit him sooner or later. But how do you explain something so devastating to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your child that the world he knew, the stability he trusted, was suddenly in pieces? After we had both calmed down, when I could feel a sense of quiet in the house, Gwen had been distant, her energy pulled into her own world, leaving me with a sense of emptiness. Louis, as always, was full of questions about his day, about school, about the small things that mattered to him. But I knew it was time. The time to tell him. I sat down with him in the living room, on the couch where we'd spent so many nights watching movies together, playing games, and just being a family. But I knew deep down, nothing would be the same again. I started slow, careful with my words, knowing I had to be as honest as possible without overwhelming him. I told him that sometimes adults make mistakes and that our family was going through a tough time. I couldn't explain everything. I knew he wouldn't understand it all, but I didn't want to lie to him either. He deserved the truth, in whatever form I could give it. I tried to keep my tone calm, but it was hard to hide the ache in my voice as I spoke. Louis looked at me with those wide, trusting eyes of his. His gaze held so much wisdom for someone so young, and I could see the confusion swirling in his mind. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, processing, absorbing. I could tell he was trying to make sense of what I was saying, the way his brow furrowed as he thought it over. I could feel the weight of his silence, his little heart trying to understand a world that was shifting beneath his feet. And then, I asked him the hardest question I'd ever asked anyone. I needed to know what he wanted, what would make him feel safe. I asked him if he wanted to stay with me, or if he felt that he needed to stay with Mom. It felt like the universe was holding its breath as I waited for his response. I wasn't sure what I wanted to hear, wasn't sure what would make this all easier. But I knew it was a question that couldn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He wanted to stay with me, and it felt like the only solid thing left in my life. His words, though simple, were everything. I want to stay with you, Dad. You always take care of me. I held him tighter, unable to stop the tears that welled up in my eyes. My heart ached with both the pain of what had been lost and the relief of knowing that he felt safe with me. In the midst of all the chaos, I was the one thing he could still rely on, the one thing that hadn't been taken from him. I promised myself right then that no matter what happened with Gwen, I would be the rock he needed, the parent who could give him stability and love. While all of this was unfolding at home, Jessie was dealing with her own fallout. She had heard everything from Gwen's mouth, and she had no illusions left. She had confronted Albert, hoping to get some sense of closure, hoping that there might be an explanation that would make sense of the hurt he had caused her. But, as expected, Albert didn't take responsibility. Instead, he tried to downplay everything, trying to convince Jessie that it meant nothing, that it was just a fling. Jessie didn't need to hear any more. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. She had spent enough time in that marriage, trying to make it work, only to be faced with a man who would never value her the way she deserved. She had spent years trying to make herself small, trying to fit into the life he expected of her, but no more. The moment had come. Jessie filed for divorce, her heart heavy but resolute. She wasn't going to stay in a relationship that had been built on lies and selfishness. She deserved more than that. She deserved a life where she wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's mistakes. I could see it in her eyes, the same determination that I had felt when I made my own decision. The future, though uncertain, had a possibility of something better, something that didn't involve betrayal or disappointment, or the pain of realizing the person you loved most had never really loved you the same way. Jessie was ready to start again, to rebuild her life without Albert dragging her down. And I could only hope that, in time, I would be able to do the same for myself and Louis. After the divorce from Gwen, life felt completely different. I was focused on providing stability for Louis, but there were moments when I couldn't shake the thoughts of everything that had come before. Gwen was no longer my wife, and it felt both unbelievable and inevitable at the same time. Jessie and I began meeting for coffee after dropping the kids off at school. At first, it was just a way to support each other, talking about our disappointments and fears, but gradually, our relationship began to shift. We started noticing how well we got along, how much we trusted each other more and more. 3 months later, I realized that something more than friendship had developed between Jessie and me. She had become someone important to me, but I wasn't rushing to label it just yet. Both Jessie and I were still too hurt to dive into anything new. We decided not to rush, simply being there for each other, supporting one another as we healed. Our connection deepened, and while we weren't yet ready for major changes, I began to believe that perhaps this was a new beginning. In the weeks following the divorce, things didn't exactly settle. Gwen, still furious and hurt, started trying to create tension between Louis and me. She claimed I was turning him against her, twisting things to make myself look like a victim. It was hard, seeing her go down this path, especially when it involved Louis. But I stayed patient, focused on being the best dad I could be. I refused to let her pull me into her anger. I had to be calm, stable for Louis, even if it was tearing me up inside. Then there was Albert. I guess he thought that the fallout from our divorces wasn't enough. After everything that had happened, he tried to worm his way back into Jessie's life, promising that things would change, that he'd learned his lesson. But Jessie wasn't having it. She'd had enough. Still, Albert wasn't about to give up that easily. When she told him no, he turned hostile, as if everything that had gone wrong was somehow her fault. It was maddening. One afternoon, he showed up uninvited at her place, demanding to see their daughter, Emma. I happened to be there, visiting Jessie for one of our regular catch-ups. I could see the tension building, and before things escalated, I stepped in. I told Albert, calmly but firmly, that he needed to leave. He didn't like it, but he didn't have much of a choice. That encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth, but it also reminded me of something important. Jessie and I were in this together, standing strong against the chaos our exes tried to create. It wasn't easy, but we had a shared goal now, protecting our kids and building something better. Each challenge only seemed to strengthen our bond. What started as support for one another was now turning into something deeper, and we both knew we'd have to be strong for the sake of our children. Through the chaos, we grew stronger, side by side.